To understand what happens spiritually when a narcissist loses an empath, we need to start with something fundamental that often gets overlooked in psychological discussions of these relationships. We're not just talking about the loss of a person or even the loss of narcissistic supply. We're talking about the loss of the narcissist's only real connection to the divine, to the transcendent, to the spiritual dimension of human existence. Let me explain what I mean by this, because it gets to something essential about how the narcissist actually experiences spiritual reality. The narcissist, by the very nature of their pathology, is cut off from direct spiritual experience. Their entire psychological structure is organized around defending against vulnerability, maintaining grandiosity, and avoiding authentic feeling, but genuine spiritual experience, connection to something greater than the ego, moments of transcendence, the felt sense of love as a universal force. All of this requires exactly what the narcissist cannot allow: surrender of the defended self, openness to being transformed by something beyond their control, willingness to experience awe and smallness in the face of mystery. So the narcissist exists in a kind of spiritual desert. They're disconnected from the numinous, from the sacred, from those moments of grace and beauty and meaning that make human life feel spiritually significant. They might perform religious or spiritual identity, attending services, speaking spiritual language, even holding positions of spiritual authority, but there's no genuine inner experience underneath the performance. It's all part of the grandiose presentation, the curated image, another arena for demonstrating superiority. But then the empath enters their life, and the empath brings something the narcissist cannot generate themselves: a living embodied connection to spiritual depth. The empath has the capacity for genuine love, not as a transaction or a performance, but as a state of being, an openness of heart that connects them to something larger than themselves. They can experience beauty and be moved by it. They can feel compassion and let it transform them. They can access transcendence through art, nature, connection, suffering. They're spiritually alive in a way the narcissist simply is not. They're spiritually alive. And in the empath's presence, the narcissist can experience these spiritual dimensions secondhand. They can witness love through the empath's capacity for it. They can touch transcendence through the empath's ability to access it. They can feel something approaching spiritual depth through proximity to someone who genuinely embodies it. The empath becomes, in essence, the narcissist's intermediary to the divine. Not in some grandiose religious sense, but in the simple, profound sense that the empath provides access to spiritual experiences and dimensions of being that the narcissist cannot reach directly. Think about what this looks like in practice. The empath brings the narcissist to a beautiful natural setting and feels genuine wonder, genuine reverence for the sacred quality of what they're witnessing. The narcissist doesn't feel this directly. They can't. Their defenses prevent it. But in observing the empath's genuine response, they can approximate the experience. They can say, yes, this is beautiful, and almost believe it, because the empath's authentic feeling creates a kind of contact high, where the empath loves the narcissist with a quality of unconditional acceptance that touches something divine, the ability to see someone fully and love them anyway. The narcissist can't generate this kind of love themselves, can't even fully receive it without their defenses interfering. But they can experience it peripherally through the empath's offering of it. And in those moments, they touch something that feels almost like grace, almost like the kind of spiritual love that religious traditions speak of. Or the empath creates meaning from suffering, transforms pain into growth, finds beauty in brokenness. And the narcissist, who typically experiences suffering only as narcissistic injury to be defended against, can witness through the empath that there's another way to hold pain, a way that's actually spiritually generative rather than just destructive. The empath is showing them constantly what it looks like to be spiritually alive, what it looks like to access dimensions of human experience that the narcissist pathology has cut them off from. And through this witnessing, through this proximity, the narcissist has a kind of borrowed spiritual life. They're not doing the inner work that would create genuine spiritual capacity, but they're close enough to someone who has done that work that they can experience its fruits indirectly. This is why the relationship with the empath often feels different to the narcissist than other relationships. It's not just that the empath provides superior supply, though they do. It's that they provide access to something the narcissist has no other way of touching: the spiritual richness of genuine human depth, authentic love, transcendent meaning. But here's the devastating spiritual consequence: when the empath leaves, that portal closes. Suddenly, completely, the narcissist's only connection to divine experience is severed. They're back in the spiritual desert they've always inhabited, but now with the consciousness of what they've lost, they know what it felt like to be near someone who could access spiritual depth, who could generate genuine love, who could transform ordinary moments into something sacred through the quality of their presence and attention. They've tasted that proximity to the divine, even if it was always borrowed, always secondhand, and now it's gone. The empath has taken their spiritual violence with them, and the narcissist is left in isolation that's not just emotional or psychological, but fundamentally spiritual. They're cut off from the very dimensions of human experience that make life feel meaningful, that connect us to something larger than our small defended selves. This is a loss that operates at a different register than anything we've discussed psychologically. It's not just loneliness or the absence of supply. It's spiritual isolation of the most profound kind, being aware that there are depths of experience, dimensions of love and meaning and beauty that you cannot access on your own and no longer have access to through another. When your only brig to the sacred was another person's soul, their departure doesn't just leave you alone. It leaves you exiled from the divine itself. Now, to understand what happens spiritually when the narcissist loses the empath, we need to talk about light and shadow, not in some abstract metaphorical sense, but as real forces in the spiritual economy of human relationships. The empath carries a particular quality of light. This isn't just warmth or kindness, though it includes those things. It's a spiritual radiance that comes from their capacity to remain open-hearted despite pain, to choose love despite fear, to maintain connection to something transcendent even in the midst of darkness. The empath's presence literally illuminates the spaces they occupy. People feel it. The narcissist certainly feels it. And here's what's crucial to understand. In the empath's presence, the narcissist could bask in that light without having to generate their own. They could exist in proximity to spiritual depth, to genuine love, to transcendent meaning, without doing any of the internal work required to access these states themselves. The empath's light was bright enough, sustained enough that it created the illusion that the narcissist too was capable of dwelling in that luminous space. Think about what this meant for the narcissist on a daily lived level. In the empath's presence, they could experience moments of beauty, connection, even something approaching grace. The empath's capacity for wonder made ordinary moments feel meaningful. Their depth of feeling created the impression of shared spiritual experience. Their forgiveness and compassion allowed the narcissist to maintain the fantasy that they too were fundamentally good, fundamentally capable of love. The empath's light was so bright that it cast the narcissist's shadow behind them out of view, easy to deny. As long as the empath remained present, radiating that spiritual luminosity, the narcissist didn't have to confront the darkness within themselves. They could position themselves in the empath's glow and mistake reflected light for their own inner radiance. But then the empath leaves, and this is where the spiritual consequences become devastating. Because when that sustaining light withdraws, when the empath's presence is no longer there to illuminate and obscure, simultaneously the narcissist is suddenly confronted with their own shadow in a way they've been successfully avoiding. The darkness they've been fleeing, the spiritual emptiness they've been denying, the void where authentic spiritual presence should be, all of it becomes visible in the absence of the empath's light. This isn't a gradual realization. It's often experienced as a kind of spiritual crisis, a sudden plunge into darkness that feels catastrophic. The narcissist has been living in borrowed light for so long that they've forgotten or never knew what their own internal landscape actually looks like. And what they discover in the empath's absence is terrifying. There's nothing there, no inner light to sustain them, no spiritual core to return to, just emptiness, shadow, the accumulated darkness of years or decades of spiritual bypassing and emotional dishonesty. The contrast is what makes this unbearable. If the narcissist had never experienced the empath's light, they might remain comfortable in their darkness, unaware that anything else was possible. But they've tasted what it's like to exist in proximity to genuine spiritual presence. They've experienced what love, depth, meaning, and transcendence feel like, even if they were only ever borrowing these experiences rather than generating them. And now they're back in the dark. But with the consciousness of what light feels like, with the memory of spiritual warmth, with the excruciating awareness of what they've lost and what they've never actually possessed within themselves. This is a particular kind of spiritual suffering that's almost impossible to articulate or remedy because the narcissist cannot return to unconscious darkness. They've seen the light, but they also cannot access their own inner light because they've done none of the work required to develop it. They've spent years, perhaps a lifetime, constructing defenses against the very vulnerability and self-honesty that spiritual development requires. So they're trapped, aware of the light, but unable to generate it. Conscious of the darkness, but unwilling to do the shadow work that would integrate it. They know what they're missing, but they can't access it through their own resources. And the person who provided access is gone. The empath's departure forces the narcissist into a confrontation with their own spiritual bankruptcy. And this confrontation is so painful, so threatening to their night-tired defensive structure that the narcissist typically responds in one of two ways. They either plunge deeper into denial, frantically seeking new sources of borrowed light to avoid facing their own darkness, or they spiral into a kind of spiritual despair that masquerades as depression, but is actually the soul's protest against its own abandonment. Neither response leads to healing because both are still avoiding the fundamental spiritual work that the narcissist needs. Turning toward their own shadow, sitting with their own darkness, doing the excruciating internal labor of developing their own light from the inside out. The empath's presence had allowed them to avoid this work indefinitely. The empath's absence makes it unavoidable, and the narcissist, faced with this spiritual reckoning, almost always chooses continued avoidance over authentic transformation, because the transformation would require everything they've spent their life defending against. Vulnerability, honesty, the dismantling of the false self, the integration of disowned parts. So the darkness that the empath's light had been obscuring doesn't just remain, it intensifies. Because now it's darkness with awareness, emptiness, with memory of fullness, spiritual poverty, with the knowledge of what wealth feels like. The narcissist is spiritually impoverished in a way they can no longer deny. And that awareness, without the willingness to do anything about it, becomes its own form of torment. When the light that obscured your darkness withdraws, finally see what you've been fleeing, and the seeing changes nothing if you still refuse to heal. But the spiritual consequences of losing the empath go beyond confrontation with inner darkness, because there's something else happening at a level that's more fundamental than psychology. Something that operates according to spiritual laws that exist, whether we acknowledge them or not. And that's the principle of karmic return, the universal tendency toward balance, reciprocity, and consequence. Now, I want to be careful here because karma is often misunderstood as some kind of cosmic punishment system, divine retribution for wrongdoing. That's not what I'm talking about. Karma in its true sense is simply the law of cause and effect, operating at the level of energy, intention, and action. What you put out into the world creates ripple that eventually return to you, not because the universe is judging you, but because that's simply how energy works. The narcissist has been operating for years, perhaps their entire life, in ways that create harm. They manipulate, they deceive, they take without giving, they damage others to protect their own fragile ego. And all of this creates karmic debt, energetic imbalance that seeks resolution, consequences that naturally flow from harmful actions. But here's what the empath was doing, often without consciously realizing it. They were absorbing and buffering those consequences. They were taking the impact of the narcissist's harmful behavior and transforming it through their own capacity for forgiveness, understanding, and unconditional love. They were essentially standing between the narcissist and the natural return of their own destructive energy. Think about what this looks like practically. When the narcissist lied, the empath believed them, sparing them the consequence of lost trust. When the narcissist raged, the empath absorbed it without retaliating, preventing the natural escalation that rage typically produces. When the narcissist betrayed, the empath forgave again and again, delaying the abandonment that betrayal normally ensures. When the narcissist caused harm, the empath made excuses for them, protected their reputation, prevented others from seeing the full extent of their destructiveness. The empath was functioning as a kind of karmic shock absorber, taking the impact of consequences that should have naturally returned to the narcissist and transforming them into something softer, something survivable, something the narcissist could continue to ignore. This wasn't healthy for the empath. We understand that now. But spiritually, it served a function for the narcissist. It allowed them to continue their destructive patterns without experiencing the full weight of natural consequences. It delayed the universe's tendency toward balance. It created a protective buffer around the narcissist that insulated them from the energetic return of their own actions. But when the empath leaves, when they finally choose themselves and walk away, this buffer disappears. And what often happens next is what I call karmic acceleration. Suddenly, all those delayed consequences, all that accumulated energetic debt, all the natural returns that the empath had been absorbing or deflecting, they begin to manifest with startling rapidity. You'll often see this as a cascade of external events in the narcissist's life. Relationships that they thought were stable suddenly collapse. Professional situations that seemed secure unravel. People who had tolerated them for years suddenly set boundaries or walk away. Secrets they thought were safely hidden come to light. Lies they thought they'd successfully maintained are exposed. The house of cards they've been building begins to fall, and it falls quickly. And from the outside, this might look like coincidence or bad luck. The narcissists themselves will certainly frame it that way. They're the victim of circumstances, of other people's dysfunction, of an unfair universe. But what's actually happening is that natural consequences are finally being allowed to complete their cycle. The empath's departure often marks an infall action point where the spiritual protection they'd been unknowingly providing is withdrawn, and the narcissist must finally face the accumulated weight of their own choices. It's not punishment. It's simply the restoration of natural balance, the universe correcting an imbalance that the empath's presence had been maintaining. This is why the period after losing an empath is often particularly chaotic and destructive for the narcissist. It's not just the loss of one person, one relationship. It's the removal of a spiritual buffer that was protecting them from the natural consequences of their own behavior across all areas of their life. And here's what's particularly significant. The narcissist had opportunities throughout the relationship to change course, to choose growth over defense, to transform the pattern before consequences accumulated. To this degree, the empath was offering not just love, but the possibility of redemption, the chance to break destructive patterns in an environment of radical acceptance. Every time the empath forgave, it was an invitation. You could choose differently. You could heal. I'm creating space for that. But the narcissist refused those invitations again and again. They mistook the empath's grace for permission to continue unchanged. They interpreted patience as proof they didn't need to transform. They used the empath's unconditional love as a license for conditional behavior. So when the empath leaves, they're not just withdrawing their personal presence. They're withdrawing the spiritual grace period they'd been extending.